let us consciously receive the gift of our next breath. This breathing that just happens over and over again, if we're lucky, for a certain amount of time, to just really notice it. Notice what it feels like. Notice what happens to your shoulders after you exhale. This gift, this breath, this gathering. Come, let us worship together. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Those are the words to the tune that Maria played to invite us to sit down this morning and begin our service. These are questions for good storytelling. And in that song later, we sing, "Life is a riddle and a mystery." Both are true. We have questions and we have answers. And sometimes we have questions that don't have easy or maybe any answers. Or maybe we would not all answer in the same way. Author F. Scott Fitzgerald of Great Gatsby fame also wrote some essays for Esquire magazine, which were published together along with some of his other work posthumously in 1945 in a book called The Crack-Up. He wrote, "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function." I know of this quote, however, not because of his essay, but because he is quoted in a powerful little book by Rebecca Solnit. Rebecca Solnit, as some of you may know, is a writer, historian, and activist who has published 20 books. Her social media posts and Substack right now are giving me life most days, as she, like Heather Cox Richardson, puts what is happening in a wider historical context, a story within a larger story, if you will. In this book, Hope in the Dark, she has several essays. In fact, the book itself began as an essay she published online about 6 weeks after the U.S. launched its war on Iraq in 2003. She quotes Fitzgerald saying, "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function." And Solnit adds, "But the summation of the state of the world often assume that it must be all one way or another. And since it is not all good, it must all suck royally." Fitzgerald's forgotten next sentence, she writes, is, "One should, for example, be able to see that things are hopeless and yet be determined to make them otherwise." Those two sentences go together. Hopeless and yet determined to make them otherwise. Hope is an action, we heard sung last week. And Solnit, in her book, notes in the foreword of this third edition of Hope in the Dark that the hope I'm interested in is about broad perspectives with specific possibilities, ones that invite or demand that we act. The stories of our lives and the lives of others matter. This week, Lynn and I did a rare thing on our day off. We went to the movies. Shocking, I know. If you know us, it is actually kind of shocking that we did that. But Lynn saw the advertisement for this and she really wanted to see it, so we went. The movie we saw was My Dead Friend Zoe. Anyone see it? Yeah. Not too many spoilers, but it was a powerful story of multiple stories, really. And without giving away too much, in case you do go see it, which I would recommend. Would you recommend? Yeah. The protagonists, Merritt and her friend Zoe, served in the U.S. Army together, deployed to Afghanistan. Hard things happen. The movie deals with post-traumatic stress and other painful parts of life and death. It is inspired by a true story of the far too common occurrence of veterans who return from Afghanistan deployment, and the stories of veterans who returned home from Vietnam who find it very difficult to cope. A powerful story that touches our own. Movies, music, musicals, storybooks, plays can all tell stories in their own way. The title for today's service was inspired by Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical Hamilton, Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? Alexander Hamilton, from that musical and actual history, dies from a gunshot during a duel. And his wife Eliza sings about how she puts herself back in the narrative and tells his story and expands her own. We are part of the American story too. Right now, history is being made right now, much of it horrible. And many are trying to do what we can to change the plot, encourage character development, create some moral to the story by stopping this constitutional crisis and attempted coup, even as we are not exactly sure what the right things are to do. We need to be strategic. We need to work with one another. For the heroes of this story won't be heroes. Because we tend to think of heroes as people coming to rescue us. No one is coming. We are it. We and every other American and every other person in the entire world who wants this nonsense to stop. We are it. The American people can shape this story. Other people of the world can shape this story. By those of us showing up with open hearts and determined minds and willing hands and listening ears, listening to those most impacted by what is happening, and then acting by following the leaders who are saying and doing what is ethical, what is constitutional, believing Black, Indigenous, and people of color, immigrants, veterans, federal workers, teachers, DEI trainers, and trans folks when we tell you how bad it already is. And in listening and in acting, help imagine a better story, a better nation, a better world for us all. Or as member L.B. Hanna said in worship in February, a new way to dream into being the fairer, kinder, gentler, more inclusive and loving world we all know is possible. And then we do our part to make it so, even though it would be easier to throw up our hands in despair or to criticize the efforts that others are making. In the first essay in the book, When We Lost, which she wrote following the Bush win over Kerry in the U.S. presidential election of 2004, Solnit wrote, "Sometime before the election was over, I vowed to keep away from what I thought of as the conversations, the tailspin of mutual wailing about how bad everything was, a recitation of the evidence against us. One exciting opportunity for the left offers is of being your own prosecutor." That just buried any hope and imagination down into a dank little foxhole of curled up despair. She continues, "Now I watch people having it and wondering what it is we get from it, the conversation that is. The certainty of despair. Is even that kind of certainty so worth pursuing? Stories trap us. Stories free us. We live and die by stories," she says, "but hearing people have the conversation is hearing them tell themselves a story they believe is being told to them. What other stories can be told? How do people recognize that they have the power to be storytellers, not just listeners?" She concludes, "Hope is the story of uncertainty, of coming to terms with the risk involved in not knowing what comes next, which is more demanding than despair, and in a way more frightening, and immeasurably more rewarding." And while we will likely get some things wrong, we have to try, right? We have to do something, to do the things we each can do and that we can collectively do to stop this dismantling of our government. Or as Representative Al Green said from the House floor on Thursday, incivility by the president can no longer be tolerated. It has to be met with righteous indignation and righteous incivility. And some of us will be swept up in the details, which prompt us to act, and some of us will be more selective in how many details we pay attention to. You do you, boo. But pay attention. The next time your phone pings, or you're listening to the radio or watching the news or reading an article, consider, who is telling this story? What is the purpose of telling this story? What story is not being told? What perspective is missing? What are we being distracted from with that story over there being told and getting our attention? Who tells the story? Pay careful attention that the right stories are amplified for good. As Stephen Schwartz wrote in the musical Wicked, I've heard it said that people come into our lives for a reason, bringing something we must learn, and we are led to those who help us most to grow, if we let them, and we help them in return. Friends, we can defy gravity. Let us be through with accepting limits because someone else says they're so. Some things we cannot change, but until we try, we'll never know. And frankly, sometimes things happen for a reason, but sometimes stuff just happens. There is no reason. There's no rhyme. It's just stuff. And we have a responsibility to create, shape, and tell the responsible, ethical, true, complicated story that helps us all most to grow, and to do so grounded in our Unitarian Universalist values. Today, some of you are on day one of our shared story, and I can hardly wait to see what we write together next. And that story is just about 124 years old. And that story of our being is part of the nation's story, which is nearly 249 years old, when the Declaration of Independence set forth some profound words, which I'll share with only mild adaptation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among all, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That when any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. It is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. It is the right to alter or abolish it. Fitzgerald invites us to see that things are hopeless and yet be determined to make them otherwise. And Solnit reminds us to come to terms with the risk of uncertainty, of not knowing what comes next, which is more demanding than despair, and in some ways more frightening, and yet immeasurably more rewarding. Once there was, and once there wasn't, a country that promised freedom from a king. Whether that country is ruled by a new king is up to us. We the people, in community. Together, we're unlimited. Life calls us on, and it is so. Amen, and blessed be.